Chapter 1. The Intercept. Joe Riggs wasn't the kind of man who believed in grand gestures. He believed in the small things, the kind that didn't cost a dime but meant everything. Holding a door open, saying thank you, listening when someone needed to talk. Kindness was free, and Joe figured if more people remembered that, the world would be a better place. It was a Tuesday, the kind that felt like it had been dipped in gray paint. The sky hung low, clouds heavy but indecisive, and the air carried that faint chill that made you wonder if winter was lurking around the corner. Joe strolled down Main Street, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, his mind half on work and half on lunch. His office was 2 blocks away, but his diner, was closer. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even particularly clean if you looked too hard at the corners. But it had character, and Joe liked places with character. The kind of joint where the coffee was strong, the pie was sweet, and the owner could cut you down with a single sentence and make you laugh while doing it. He was halfway through mentally debating between a BLT and the meatloaf special when he saw her. She was walking toward him, heels clicking against the sidewalk like punctuation marks. Tall, poised, the kind of woman who looked like she belonged in a glossy magazine spread about power and elegance. Her coat was tailored, her hair a sleek curtain of chestnut that caught the weak sunlight and made it shine. Joe noticed her, sure, but what really caught his attention were the 2 men trailing behind her. Suits. Dark, expensive-looking suits. They weren't talking. They weren't smiling. Their eyes were locked on her like heat-seeking missiles, and something about the way they moved, steady, deliberate, made the hair on the back of Joe's neck stand up. He slowed his pace, instincts kicking in. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a hero. He was just a guy who believed in doing the right thing, and right now, the right thing looked like stepping in before something bad happened. Joe pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the keypad. Call the police? Maybe. But what if he was wrong? What if they were co-workers? Friends? No, friends didn't look like that. Friends didn't scan the street like they were calculating escape routes. He made a decision. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. He angled his path so he'd intercept her right in front of the diner. If he could get her inside, she'd be safe. He could explain, she could call someone, and if he was wrong, well, he'd look like an idiot, but at least she'd be okay. 5 feet away now. She hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on her phone. Joe raised his own like he was about to ask for directions, plastering on a smile that he hoped looked friendly and not like a lunatic. Excuse me, he said, stepping into her path. She stopped short, startled, eyes flicking up to meet his. They were green, sharp, clear, and currently filled with suspicion. Joe held up his phone like a peace offering. Sorry to bother you, he said, voice low, calm. Then he leaned in just enough so only she could hear. Don't turn around. There are 2 men in suits following you, and they look dangerous. I promise I'm not trying to scam you. Please, come into the diner with me. You can call someone. Her brows shot up, surprise flashing across her face. Joe read it as fear. What it really was, though he didn't know yet, was amusement. And maybe a little curiosity. She began, but Joe pressed on. Please, he said, earnest. I'm not crazy. Look, I'd feel better if you were somewhere safe. For a beat, she just stared at him. Then, slowly, she glanced past his shoulder, where the diner's neon sign buzzed faintly against the gray sky. Her lips curved, not in fear, but in something that looked suspiciously like a smile. Okay, she said finally. Lead the way. Relief washed over Joe like a tide. He opened the door for her, the bell above jingling as they stepped inside. The warmth hit him first, then the familiar scent of coffee and fried food. The diner was half full, regulars hunched over plates, the hum of conversation blending with the clatter of dishes. Behind the counter, Marlene, the silver-haired queen of sarcasm, looked up, eyes narrowing as she clocked Joe and his unexpected companion. Well, she drawled, voice like gravel wrapped in honey. Joe Riggs, bringing in a date? Stop the presses. Joe flushed. Not a date, Marlene, he muttered, guiding the woman to a booth near the window. Just helping out. Marlene's gaze slid to the woman, then to the 2 suits who had followed them in and stationed themselves near the door like sentinels. One brow arched. Helping out, huh? Looks like you brought the Secret Service. Joe ignored her, turning to the woman as they slid into the booth. You okay? He asked softly. She smiled then, really smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. I'm fine, she said. But I think we need to talk. Chapter 2. The Misunderstanding. Joe sat across from her, hands clasped on the table like he was waiting for a verdict. The diner's hum wrapped around them. Clinking silverware, the hiss of the griddle, Marlene's voice barking orders like a drill sergeant with a heart of gold. Outside, the gray afternoon pressed against the windows, but inside, everything felt sharper, brighter, like the world had tilted just a little. The woman, he still didn't know her name, slid out of her coat with the kind of grace that made Joe suddenly aware of his own scuffed boots and jacket that had seen better days. She set the coat beside her, then leaned back, studying him with eyes that were far too amused for someone who'd just been rescued. So, she said, voice smooth, warm, carrying a hint of laughter. You think I'm in danger? Joe cleared his throat. I didn't think. I knew. He nodded toward the door, where the two suits stood like statues, scanning the room with professional detachment. Those guys have been tailing you since the corner. You didn't notice. Her lips curved. Oh, I noticed. That threw him. Then why? They're with me, she said simply, like that explained everything. Joe blinked. With you? Like, co-workers? Not exactly. She reached for the menu, flipping it open with manicured fingers. They're my security detail. Joe stared. Security detail, he repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it less ridiculous. You have bodyguards? 2 of them, she said lightly, eyes scanning the specials. Sometimes 3 if I'm traveling. Joe sat back, trying to process that. Okay, he said slowly. So, you're not being stalked. Nope. And I didn't just save you from imminent danger. Not even a little. Her smile widened, and Joe felt heat creep up his neck. But, she added, closing the menu and meeting his gaze, it was very sweet of you to try. Sweet. Joe wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. He rubbed the back of his neck, chuckling awkwardly. Well, that's embarrassing. Not at all, she said, and there was something in her tone, something soft, genuine, that made him look up. Honestly, it's refreshing. Refreshing, Joe echoed. Most people don't call making a fool of yourself refreshing. She laughed then, a low, melodic sound that turned a few heads in the diner. You didn't make a fool of yourself. You saw something that looked wrong and you acted. That's rare. Joe shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Just seemed like the right thing to do. Exactly. She tilted her head, studying him like he was a puzzle she wanted to solve. You didn't hesitate. You didn't think about what you'd get out of it. You just helped. Joe shifted in his seat, suddenly wishing he'd ordered coffee already. Well, I'm glad you're okay, he said gruffly. Even if I jumped the gun. You did, she said, eyes dancing. But in a good way. Before Joe could respond, Marlene appeared, pad in hand, eyes flicking between them like a hawk circling prey. You two ready? Or should I give you another minute to make googly eyes? Joe groaned. Marlene. What? She smirked, pen poised. I'm just saying, Joe, you usually eat alone. This is news. Joe shot the woman an apologetic look. Ignore her. She's colorful. I like colorful, the woman said, smiling at Marlene. I'll have the BLT, extra crispy bacon, and a coffee. Black. Marlene scribbled, then turned to Joe with a look that said she'd be grilling him later. And you? Meatloaf special, Joe muttered. And coffee. Coming right up. Marlene sauntered off, leaving behind a trail of curiosity thick enough to choke on. Joe exhaled, then leaned forward. So, security detail. That's not something most people have. You, mind if I ask why? She hesitated, then smiled faintly. I'm Claire Donovan. The name meant nothing to Joe, at least not immediately. He frowned. Okay. I run Donovan Tech, she said, watching his face for recognition. It hit him like a slow-moving train. Donovan Tech, the company that had its name plastered across half the billboards downtown. Software, apps, something about AI. Joe didn't keep up, but he knew enough to realize she wasn't just important. She was big deal important. Oh, he said eloquently. You're wow. Claire laughed again, softer this time. That's one way to put it. Joe shook his head, still trying to wrap his mind around it. So you're, like, the boss. The boss, she confirmed. Which means I attract attention. Not all of it good. Joe glanced at the suits by the door, suddenly feeling less like a hero and more like a guy who'd wandered into a movie he didn't belong in. Right, he said. Makes sense. Claire leaned in, elbows resting on the table. You still think I need saving? Joe smiled wryly. From those guys? No. From Marlene? Maybe. Claire grinned, and for a moment, the weight of her title, her world, seemed to fall away. She looked normal, human, and Joe felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The food arrived, breaking the spell. Marlene set down plates with a flourish, muttering something about romantic rescues before disappearing again. Joe picked up his fork, trying to ignore the way Claire's presence seemed to fill the booth, the diner, the whole damn room. They ate, they talked about nothing and everything. Claire asked about his work, his life. Joe kept it simple. He was a project manager at a construction firm. He had a 14-year-old son named Ryan. He liked old diners and good coffee. Claire listened like it mattered, like she wasn't just being polite. And when she spoke about her company, her insane schedule, the pressure that came with being Claire Donovan, Joe listened too. Really listened. By the time they finished, the suits were still by the door, Marlene was still watching like a hawk, and Joe was still wondering how the hell his Tuesday had turned into this. Claire slid on her coat, standing with effortless grace. Thank you, she said, and Joe knew she meant more than the meal. For everything. Joe shrugged, trying to play it cool. Anytime. She smiled, then reached into her bag, pulling out a sleek black card. Call me, she said, sliding it across the table. Or don't. But I hope you do. And then she was gone, heels clicking, suits in tow, leaving Joe staring at the card like it was a ticket to a world he wasn't sure he belonged in. Chapter 3. The Ripple Effect. Joe stared at the black card on his desk like it might sprout legs and walk away. Sleek, glossy, embossed with a name that suddenly felt heavier than it had an hour ago. Claire Donovan. Below it, a phone number and an email address that probably went straight to someone important. Maybe even her. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The office hummed around him. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, the low murmur of voices, but Joe barely heard any of it. His mind was still at the diner, replaying every second like a movie he wasn't sure how to interpret. She'd smiled at him. Not a polite smile. Not the kind you give a stranger who holds the door. A real smile. Warm, bright, like she meant it. And then she'd handed him that card. Like it was nothing. Like it was normal. Joe snorted softly. Normal, right? Because it was totally normal for a construction project manager to have lunch with a tech mogul and walk away with her number. Totally normal for her to say, I hope you call. He glanced at the clock. 2 hours until quitting time. 2 hours to decide whether he was going to do something about that card or shove it in a drawer and pretend today never happened. His phone buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it, half expecting Claire's name to pop up, though he had no idea how that would even happen. Instead, it was Ryan. Hey, Dad. His son's voice came through, bright and familiar. You busy? Never too busy for you, kiddo? Joe said, smiling despite himself. What's up? Just checking in. Mom said you were working late yesterday. Yeah, had a deadline, Joe said, leaning back in his chair. But I'm free tonight. You coming over tomorrow? Yep. Got math homework, so brace yourself. Joe chuckled. I'll stock up on coffee. Ryan laughed, then hesitated. You sound weird. Joe blinked. Weird? Yeah, like, distracted. Joe hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than inventing something. Met someone today. There was a beat of silence. Then Ryan's voice shot up an octave. Wait, what? Like, met someone. Joe rubbed his forehead. Don't make it a big deal. Dad. Ryan sounded like he'd just discovered a new planet. You haven't dated since forever. Not forever, Joe said mildly. Just a while. Who is she? What's her name? Is she nice? Does she like dogs? Do you like her? Joe laughed, shaking his head. Slow down, champ. Her name's Claire. She's nice. Claire, Ryan repeated, like he was filing it away for future interrogation. Okay, tell me everything. Joe hesitated, glancing at the card again. Met her at the diner. That's it? You met her at the diner. Well, Joe cleared his throat. I thought she was in trouble. Ryan groaned. Dad. What? 2 guys were following her. Looked shady. And they were her bodyguards. Ryan burst out laughing so hard Joe had to hold the phone away from his ear. Oh my God. Dad, you tried to rescue a billionaire. She's not. Joe stopped. Okay, maybe. Ryan wheezed. This is the best thing I've ever heard. Joe smiled, shaking his head. Glad I could entertain you. Are you gonna call her? Ryan asked, suddenly serious. Joe looked at the card again, the weight of it pressing down like a question he didn't know how to answer. Don't know, he said honestly. Well, you should, Ryan said firmly. You're always telling me to take chances. Maybe you should listen to yourself. Joe chuckled. You're getting too smart for your own good. Someone has to keep you in line, Ryan said cheerfully. Okay, I gotta go. Call her Dad. The line clicked off, leaving Joe alone with his thoughts, and the card that suddenly felt like a dare. Across town, Claire Donovan sat in her office, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass like a painting. Her assistant hovered in the doorway, tablet in hand. Your 3 o'clock is confirmed, the assistant said, and the board wants an update on the merger. Claire nodded absently, scrolling through emails. Fine. Send them the numbers. The assistant hesitated. You seem distracted. Claire smiled faintly. Just thinking. About a man in a worn jacket who'd stepped in without hesitation. About the look in his eyes when he said, please, come with me. About the way he'd listened, really listened, like her words mattered. It had been a long time since anyone surprised her. Longer still since anyone had done something for her without expecting something in return. Cancel my 5 o'clock, Claire said suddenly. The assistant blinked. Cancel? Yes. Claire closed her laptop, standing with a grace that came from years of practice. I need an hour. For what? Claire smiled, a secret curve of her lips. To see if a good man calls. Joe stared at the card until the numbers blurred. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. Chapter 4. The invitation. Joe had never been nervous about making a phone call in his life. He'd called clients, contractors, even city inspectors without breaking a sweat. But calling Claire Donovan? That was different. That was like dialing into another universe. He'd done it anyway. And now, 2 days later, he was staring at his phone again, rereading the text she'd sent after their brief conversation. Claire, how do you feel about tuxedos? Joe had stared at that message for a solid 5 minutes before replying. Joe, depends. Are we talking James Bond or prom night disaster? Her response had come fast, like she'd been waiting. Claire, Bond. Definitely Bond. Charity gala this Saturday. Come with me? Joe had typed, deleted, retyped, and finally settled on, Joe, you sure you want to bring a guy who thinks meatloaf is fancy? Claire, positive. 7 p.m. I'll send the details. And just like that, Joe Riggs, single dad, lover of diners and worn boots, was going to a charity gala with a woman who probably had her name engraved on the invitations. Saturday loomed like a storm cloud. Joe stood in his bedroom, staring at the tuxedo hanging from the closet door. It wasn't his. It belonged to his neighbor, Frank, who'd loaned it with a grin and a warning. Don't spill anything on it, Riggs. That tux has seen more weddings than a Vegas chapel. Joe eyed the tux like it might bite. Black, sleek, intimidating. He tried it on earlier and while it fit, it felt wrong. Like wearing someone else's skin. He tugged at the collar, grimacing. Dad? Ryan said from the doorway. Phone in hand. Smirk firmly in place. You look like a penguin. Joe shot him a look. Helpful. Ryan grinned. Seriously, though, you clean up okay. Just don't try to moonwalk. Joe groaned. Why would I moonwalk? Because you panic in social situations and do weird stuff, Ryan said cheerfully. Remember Aunt Linda's wedding? That was one time, Joe muttered, adjusting the bow tie that felt like a noose. And I was trying to avoid the chicken dance. Ryan snorted. Good luck avoiding anything tonight. Rich people love weird dances. Joe sighed, glancing at the clock. You sure you're good at moms? Yep. She and Mark are making tacos. I'm living the dream. Ryan paused, then softened. You're gonna be fine, Dad. Joe smiled, ruffling his son's hair. Thanks, kiddo. Ryan grinned. Just don't embarrass yourself. Appreciate the vote of confidence, Joe said dryly. The gala was held at the Grandview Hotel, a place Joe had only seen from the outside, the kind of building that looked like it charged you for breathing near it. The lobby gleamed with marble floors and chandeliers that probably cost more than Joe's truck. He stepped inside, feeling like every eye was on him, though most people were too busy sipping champagne and laughing in voices that sounded expensive. Claire was waiting near the entrance, and for a second, Joe forgot how to breathe. She wore a deep emerald gown that hugged her like it had been designed just for her. Her hair was swept up, a few strands framing her face, and when she smiled at him, the whole damn room seemed to dim. Joe, she said warmly, stepping forward. You made it. Wouldn't miss it, he said, hoping his voice didn't crack like a teenager's. You look wow. Her smile widened. So do you. Joe glanced down at the tux, tugging at the collar. I feel like I should apologize to James Bond. Claire laughed, looping her arm through his. You're perfect. Perfect. Joe wasn't sure about that, but he let her lead him into the ballroom, where the ceiling soared and the tables glittered with crystal and silver. People turned to look, at Claire mostly, but some at him, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Joe ignored it, focusing on not tripping over the carpet. Just relax, Claire murmured, sensing his tension. It's a fundraiser, not a firing squad. Easy for you to say, Joe muttered. You belong here. She squeezed his arm. And tonight, so do you. The evening unfolded like a dream Joe wasn't sure he'd wake from. There were speeches, auctions, laughter that sounded rehearsed. Joe stuck close to Claire, answering questions when introduced, smiling politely when someone asked what he did. Construction, he'd say, and watch their brows lift like he'd just confessed to being a plumber at a palace. But Claire never flinched. She stayed by his side, her hand brushing his arm now and then, her smile steady. And when a man in a tailored suit, slick hair, smug grin, made a snide remark about blue-collar charm, Claire shut him down with a single sentence that left the guy blinking like he'd been slapped. Joe stared at her, stunned. You didn't have to do that. Yes, she said simply. I did. And then the music started. A slow, elegant melody. And Claire turned to him with a look that made his heart trip over itself. Dance with me. Joe hesitated. Claire, just one, she said softly, holding out her hand. He took it. And for a moment, in the middle of a glittering ballroom, Joe Riggs forgot about tuxedos and chandeliers and the fact that he didn't belong. Because Claire was smiling at him like he did. Chapter 5. Fish out of water. Joe had never felt more out of place in his life. The ballroom shimmered like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers dripping light, tables dressed in white linen and gold accents, waiters gliding by with trays of champagne like they were born doing it. Everyone looked like they belonged. Everyone except Joe Riggs. He tugged at his borrowed tuxedo collar for the 10th time, wishing it would stop feeling like a chokehold. Around him, conversations floated like bubbles. Words like merger, portfolio, acquisition, and Joe understood exactly none of them. He was a construction guy. His world was blueprints and deadlines, not hedge funds and stock options. Claire, on the other hand, moved through the crowd like a queen in her court. Elegant, poised, her emerald gown catching the light with every step. People gravitated toward her, smiles wide, voices warm. But Joe noticed something they probably didn't. The way her shoulders stiffened just slightly when someone mentioned numbers. The way her smile dimmed when a man leaned in too close, his laugh too loud, his eyes too calculating. She didn't like this world as much as they thought she did. And somehow that made Joe feel a little less like an alien. "Joe," Claire said, turning to him with a smile that made the room fade. "You okay?" "Define okay," Joe muttered, earning a soft laugh. "You're doing fine," she said, looping her arm through his. "Better than most." "Most what?" Joe asked. "Most guys who look like they wandered in from a hardware store?" Claire grinned. "Most men who think tuxedos are torture devices." Joe smirked. "I stand by that." She squeezed his arm, then leaned in. "Ignore the noise. Just be you." Easy for her to say. Joe glanced around, catching snippets of conversation that sounded like another language. He was about to ask Claire if they could make a break for the buffet when a man stepped into their path. Tall, immaculate suit, hair slicked back like he'd used half a bottle of something expensive. His smile was sharp, his eyes colder than the champagne he held. "Claire," he said smoothly, ignoring Joe entirely. "You look stunning." "Thank you, Victor," Claire said, her tone polite but cool. "Enjoying the evening?" Victor's smile widened. "Better now." His gaze flicked to Joe, dismissive. "And you are?" "Joe," Joe said evenly, meeting his eyes. "Friend of Claire's." Victor's brows lifted, amusement flickering. "Friend," he repeated, like the word was a joke. "Interesting." Joe felt his jaw tighten, but before he could say something he'd regret, Claire spoke. "Victor," she said, voice like steel wrapped in silk. "Joe is with me." Victor blinked, then smiled again, tight, fake. "Of course. Well, enjoy the gala." He walked away, leaving behind a trail of cologne and arrogance. Joe exhaled slowly. "Friend, huh?" Claire turned to him, eyes warm. "Would you prefer hero?" Joe chuckled. "I'd settle for guy who didn't punch Victor." Claire laughed, the sound soft and genuine, and Joe felt something loosen in his chest. He wasn't part of this world, but maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to be. The music shifted, slow and smooth, and couples began drifting to the dance floor. Claire looked at Joe, her smile turning playful. "Dance with me." Joe froze. "Claire, don't overthink it," she said, holding out her hand. "Just one dance." Joe hesitated, then took her hand. Her fingers were warm, soft, and when she led him onto the floor, the rest of the room blurred. He wasn't a dancer. He'd proven that at Aunt Linda's wedding when he'd nearly taken out a centerpiece during the chicken dance. But Claire moved like water, and somehow, Joe found himself moving with her. Awkward at first, then easier, like her confidence was contagious. "You're not bad," she murmured, eyes sparkling. "Don't lie to me," Joe said, grinning. "I'm not," she said softly. "You're real." Real. The word hit him harder than he expected. In a room full of polished masks, Joe Riggs was just Joe Riggs. And for some reason, Claire Donovan seemed to like that. The song ended, but neither of them let go right away. When they finally stepped off the floor, Joe felt lighter. Like maybe tuxedos weren't so bad after all. Later, as they stood near the balcony overlooking the city lights, Claire turned to him, her expression softer than he'd seen all night. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" Joe asked. "For being here," she said simply. "For making tonight better." Joe smiled, heart thudding in his chest. "Anytime," and he meant it. Chapter 6. The complication. Joe had never been good at reading rooms, but even he could tell something had shifted the moment Claire's smile faltered. It happened halfway through the gala, just as Joe was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, he belonged. They danced, laughed, even shared a quiet moment on the balcony, where the city lights stretched like a glittering ocean. For the first time in years, Joe felt alive. Like the world wasn't just work and parenting schedules and bills. Like there was something more. Then he showed up. Joe didn't know his name at first. All he knew was that the man moved through the crowd like he owned it. Tall, polished, the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. His suit probably cost more than Joe's truck, and his smile was the kind that made Joe's fists itch. Claire saw him before Joe did. Her posture changed, shoulders stiff, chin lifting like armor sliding into place. The warmth in her eyes cooled, replaced by something Joe couldn't quite name. Resentment? Regret? Both? The man reached them in 3 strides, his grin sharp as glass. "Claire," he said, voice smooth as silk. "You look breathtaking." Joe hated him instantly. "Hello, Ethan," Claire said, her tone polite but clipped. "Enjoying the evening?" "Better now," Ethan said, ignoring Joe completely. His gaze lingered on Claire like she was something he owned. "You didn't return my calls." "That's because I didn't want to," Claire said evenly. Ethan chuckled, like her words were a joke. "You always did play hard to get." Joe felt his jaw tighten. He wasn't the jealous type, never had been, but something about Ethan's smugness made his blood simmer. He cleared his throat, stepping slightly closer to Claire. "Everything okay?" Joe asked, his voice calm but firm. Ethan's eyes flicked to him for the first time, assessing, dismissing. "And you are?" Joe said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Claire's date. The word hung between them like a gauntlet. Ethan's smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. Date, he repeated, as if tasting something sour. Interesting. Claire's hand slid into Joe's arm, her grip warm, steady. Very, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Excuse us, Ethan. She led Joe away before Ethan could respond, her heels clicking like gunfire against the marble floor. They didn't stop until they reached the far end of the ballroom, near a cluster of towering floral arrangements that smelled faintly of roses and tension. Joe turned to her, brows furrowed. Want to tell me what that was? Claire exhaled, her shoulders sagging for the first time all night. Ethan, she said, the name heavy with history. My ex. Joe blinked. Ex? Like ex-boyfriend? Ex-fiancé, Claire corrected softly. Joe stared. Fiancé. She nodded, eyes clouded. It was years ago, before Donovan Tech became what it is now. Before I realized he cared more about my bank account than my heart. Joe felt something twist in his chest. Anger, protectiveness, maybe both. And now he's what? Trying to win you back. Claire's laugh was brittle. Trying to remind me he exists. He hates losing. Joe studied her face, the tension etched along her jaw, the way her fingers curled slightly like she was holding something back. He wanted to say something. Something that would erase the shadow Ethan had cast. But words felt clumsy, inadequate. So he settled for honesty. You don't owe him anything, Joe said quietly. Not your time. Not your attention. Not a damn thing. Claire looked at him then. Really looked, and for a moment, the weight in her eyes lifted. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is, Joe said, shrugging. People like him, they thrive on drama. You don't have to give it to him. Her lips curved, faint but real. You're good at this. Good at what? Making things feel less complicated. Joe smiled wryly. That's because I'm a simple guy. Claire laughed softly, and the sound eased something tight in Joe's chest. But the moment didn't last. Across the room, Ethan was watching them, his smile sharp, his eyes promising trouble. Joe didn't like it. Not one bit. Later, in the quiet of his truck, Joe gripped the steering wheel and stared at the city lights. Tonight had been incredible. Complicated, yes, but incredible. And yet, as he replayed Ethan's smug grin and Claire's brittle laugh, doubt crept in like a thief. She was Claire Donovan, CEO, powerhouse, a woman who could silence a room with a glance. And Joe? He was a guy who spent his days wrangling subcontractors and his nights helping his kid with algebra. Different worlds, different rules. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan was right about one thing. It was interesting. Chapter 7. The turning point. Joe didn't expect to hear from Claire so soon. After the gala and Ethan's unwelcome cameo, he figured she'd need space. Time to shake off the tension that had clung to her like perfume. But the next evening, as Joe was rinsing dishes and Ryan was sprawled on the couch with his math homework, his phone buzzed. Claire. Coffee tomorrow? My office. Noon. Joe stared at the message, water dripping from his hands into the sink. Coffee. At her office. Noon. He wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a warning shot, but he typed back anyway. Joe, I'll bring my best manners. Her reply came fast. Claire, don't. Bring yourself. The next day, Joe walked into Donovan Tech like a man stepping onto another planet. Glass walls, sleek furniture, people moving with purpose, their clothes sharp enough to cut. He felt every inch the outsider. But when Claire appeared in the lobby, all that noise faded. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and when she smiled at him, Joe felt something shift inside him, like gravity had changed. Joe, she said warmly, come on. There's a quiet spot upstairs. He followed her through a maze of hallways and up a flight of stairs to a lounge that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. Soft chairs, muted colors, sunlight spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows. Claire gestured to a corner table, and they sat, steaming mugs between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, charged, like both of them were waiting for the other to break it. Claire did. About last night, she began, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. I'm sorry. Joe frowned. For what? For Ethan, she said, her jaw tightening. For dragging you into that. Joe shook his head. You didn't drag me anywhere. I wanted to be there. Her eyes lifted, searching his face. Even after that? Especially after that, Joe said simply. Claire's lips curved, faint but real. You're something else. Joe chuckled. Not sure if that's good or bad. It's good, she said, her tone firm now. Joe, people like Ethan, they're everywhere in my world. Men who think money buys everything. Who see me as a trophy, not a person. Joe leaned forward, his hands wrapped around his mug. Sounds exhausting. It is, she admitted, her gaze dropping to the coffee. And lonely. The word hung between them, raw and unpolished. Joe felt it like a punch. Not because he pitied her, but because he understood. Loneliness wasn't about being alone. It was about being unseen. and Joe knew that feeling better than he cared to admit. "Claire," he said quietly, "you're not a trophy. You're you. Smart, strong, funny, and yeah, intimidating as hell sometimes, but in a good way." Her laugh was soft, almost shaky. "Intimidating?" Joe grinned. "You walked into that gala like you owned the building." "I did own the building," she said dryly. Joe laughed, and for a moment, the tension cracked, light spilling through. But then Claire's smile faded, and her eyes met his, unguarded. "Do you ever wonder," she said slowly, "if people like us live in different worlds?" Joe hesitated. "Sometimes. And does that scare you?" Joe thought about it, the tuxedo, the marble floors, Ethan's smug grin. Then he thought about Claire laughing in a diner, her eyes warm, her voice soft when she said, "Don't overthink it." "No," he said finally. "Not if the person's worth it." Claire stared at him, something flickering in her eyes. Surprise, hope, maybe both. Then she smiled, and it wasn't the polished smile she wore for cameras or boardrooms. It was real, bright, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Joe Riggs," she murmured, shaking her head. "You're dangerous." Joe grinned. "I've been called worse." They talked for an hour about everything and nothing. About Ryan and his obsession with tacos. About Claire's first job, which involved answering phones in a cramped office with a broken air conditioner. About dreams, regrets, the kind of truths you don't share with just anyone. When Joe finally stood to leave, Claire walked him to the elevator. They paused there, the hum of the building around them, the weight of something unspoken pressing close. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me," she said. "Not the company, not the headlines. Me." Joe swallowed hard. "Always." The elevator doors slid open, and Joe stepped inside. As they closed, Claire's smile lingered in his mind like a promise. Chapter 8. The fallout. Joe had been riding a quiet high since that coffee with Claire. It wasn't just the conversation. It was the way she'd looked at him. Like he mattered. Like he wasn't just some guy who fixed schedules and argued with subcontractors. For the first time in years, Joe felt like he was stepping into something good. Something real. Until Thursday. It started with a phone call he wasn't supposed to hear. Joe had dropped by Donovan Tech to surprise Claire with lunch. Nothing fancy. Just sandwiches from the deli she'd mentioned liking. He'd cleared it with her assistant, who smiled and waved him toward the glass-walled office at the end of the hall. Claire was inside, back to the door, phone pressed to her ear. Joe paused, not wanting to interrupt. He was about to knock when her voice carried through the glass, sharp, clipped, nothing like the warmth he'd heard 2 days ago. "I don't care what it costs," she said, pacing. "Lock it down. If this deal falls through, we're exposed." Joe froze, the words hitting like cold water. Costs. Lock it down. Exposed. It sounded ruthless, like the kind of corporate maneuvering he'd always hated, the kind that chewed people up and spat them out. Then came the part that twisted the knife. "I don't have time for distractions," Claire said, her tone hard. "Not now." Distractions. Joe felt the word like a punch to the gut. He didn't need context. He didn't need details. He knew what it meant. He was the distraction. He left the sandwiches with the assistant and walked out without knocking. The city felt different as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Colder, louder, like it was reminding him where he stood. Claire Donovan was a force of nature, a woman with a world balanced on her shoulders. And Joe? He was a guy who thought bringing lunch would make her smile. Stupid. By the time he got home, the doubt had settled deep, heavy as concrete. He didn't call, didn't text. He told himself it was for the best. Claire had her life, her empire, her battles. She didn't need him complicating things. Ryan noticed, of course. He always did. "You're quiet," his son said that night, sprawled on the couch with a video game controller. "Something wrong?" Joe forced a smile. "Just tired." Ryan frowned. "You didn't call her, did you?" Joe hesitated. "No. Why not?" Joe stared at the muted glow of the TV, words sticking in his throat. "Because sometimes things aren't as simple as you want them to be." Ryan snorted. "That's a cop-out." Joe chuckled softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe." Across town, Claire sat in her office long after everyone had gone home. The city lights glittered beyond the glass, but she barely saw them. Her phone lay silent on the desk, and for the first time in weeks, she hated the quiet. She thought about Joe, his laugh, his honesty, the way he'd looked at her like she was more than a headline. She thought about the sandwiches her assistant had mentioned, the ones he'd left without a word, and she wondered why that hurt more than any deal ever could. Chapter 9. The gesture. Joe wasn't a grand gesture guy. He didn't believe in skywriting or flash mobs or anything that involved choreographed dancing. But he believed in fixing things when they mattered, and Claire Donovan mattered. It had been 3 days since he'd walked out of her office without saying a word. 3 days of silence that felt heavier than any steel beam he'd ever hoisted. He'd replayed that phone call in his head 100 times, the word distraction echoing like a warning bell. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something. He'd made assumptions. He'd let fear do the talking. And fear was a lousy advisor. So Joe decided to do something about it. Something honest. Something that said what he couldn't seem to put into words. Saturday morning found him in his kitchen, surrounded by chaos. Cardboard boxes, markers, a roll of duct tape. Ryan leaned against the counter, watching with the kind of bemused expression only a teenager could pull off. Dad, Ryan said slowly. What is this? Joe grinned, holding up a sign he just finished scrawling in bold letters. Not a distraction. Just a guy who cares. Ryan blinked. You're making signs? Not just signs, Joe said, gesturing to the boxes. Props. Ryan stared. Props. Joe nodded, stacking the boxes into something vaguely resembling a tower. Claire's office is all glass, right? I'm gonna set this up outside her building. Ryan gaped. You're staging a protest? Joe laughed. Not a protest. A declaration. Ryan shook his head, grinning despite himself. You're insane. Probably, Joe said, taping another sign to the tower. Free kindness. No strings attached. Ryan chuckled, then sobered. You really like her, huh? Joe paused, meeting his son's eyes. Yeah, I do. Ryan smiled, soft and genuine. Then go get her. By noon, Joe was standing outside Donovan Tech with his makeshift tower of boxes and a thermos of coffee balanced on top. He'd taped 3 signs to the stack. Not a distraction. Just a guy who cares. And brings coffee. People stared. Phones came out. Someone laughed. Joe didn't care. He stood there in his worn jacket and scuffed boots, heart thudding like a jackhammer, waiting. And then she appeared. Claire stepped out of the revolving doors, heels clicking, hair catching the sunlight. She stopped dead when she saw him, her eyes widening, her lips parting in shock. Joe, she said, walking toward him like she wasn't sure if she should laugh or call security. What is this? Joe grinned, rubbing the back of his neck. A gesture. Claire stared at the signs, then at him. You're standing outside my office with boxes. Not just boxes, Joe said. A message. Her brows lifted. Which is? Joe took a breath, the city noise fading around him. I heard you the other day, the call. You said you didn't have time for distractions. And I thought, that's me. I'm the distraction. Claire's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. So Joe pressed on. But then I realized something, he said, voice steady now. You're not a distraction to me. You're the opposite. You make things clearer, better. And if that means standing out here looking like an idiot, then fine. I'll be the best idiot you've ever seen. For a beat, silence hung between them. Then Claire laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that turned heads on the sidewalk. She walked up to him, heels clicking, and stopped so close he could smell her perfume, warm and subtle. You are, she said softly, absolutely ridiculous. Joe grinned. Yeah, but you're smiling. Claire shook her head, still laughing, and then, before Joe could process it, she kissed him, right there on the sidewalk with half the city watching. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. You're not a distraction, Joe, she said. You're exactly what I needed. Joe swallowed hard, his heart doing somersaults. So, does that mean I can take these boxes home? Claire laughed again, looping her arm through his. Leave them. Let the world wonder. As they walked away together, Joe felt lighter than he had in years. Because sometimes the best gestures weren't grand, they were honest. And this one had worked. Chapter 10. The resolution. Sunday afternoon sunlight spilled through the diner's windows, painting the worn booths in warm gold. The bell above the door jingled as Joe stepped inside, Ryan trailing behind him with the easy confidence of a kid who knew this place like home. Joe had been coming here for years, but today felt different. Today he wasn't just here for coffee and pie. Today he was here with Claire. She was already seated in the corner booth, her emerald eyes bright against the soft light, her smile warm enough to melt every doubt Joe had carried. She looked relaxed. No boardroom armor, no polished mask. Just Claire, in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. And when she saw Joe and Ryan, her smile widened like the sun breaking through clouds. Hey, she said softly, standing as they approached. Hey, Joe replied, his voice steady but his heart doing somersaults. Hope you don't mind the company. Claire glanced at Ryan, her expression softening. Not at all. Ryan grinned, sliding into the booth beside Joe. So you're the famous Claire. Claire laughed, settling across from them. Famous, huh? That's what Dad says, Ryan teased, shooting Joe a look that made him groan. I did not say that, Joe muttered, earning a grin from both of them. Marlene appeared then, pad in hand, her silver hair gleaming under the lights. She eyed Claire, then Joe, then Ryan, her brows arching like question marks. Well, she drawled. Joe Riggs, bringing in reinforcements. Stop the presses. Joe sighed. Marlene. What? She smirked. I'm just saying this is news. You want the usual? Yeah, Joe said. And whatever Claire wants. Coffee, Claire said, smiling. Black. Marlene scribbled, then turned to Ryan. And you, kid? Burger, Ryan said. Extra fries. Coming right up. Marlene sauntered off, muttering something about romantic rescues under her breath. For a moment, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the diner wrapping around them like an old quilt. Then Claire leaned forward, her gaze steady on Joe. "So," she said softly, "about the other day." Joe shook his head. "You don't have to explain." "I want to," Claire said, her voice firm but gentle. "That call, you heard me say I didn't have time for distractions. I wasn't talking about you." Joe hesitated. "Sure sounded like it." "I was talking about chaos," Claire said, her eyes earnest. "About deals and deadlines and people like Ethan who thrive on drama. You're not chaos, Joe. You're the opposite." Joe swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "Then why didn't you call?" Claire smiled faintly. "Because I thought you needed space. And maybe I was scared." "Scared?" Joe blinked. "Of what?" "Of wanting something real," Claire said quietly. "Because real means risk." Joe stared at her, the weight of her words settling deep. Then he reached across the table, his hand covering hers, warm and steady. "Claire," he said softly, "I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking for honest. For us. Whatever that looks like." Her fingers curled around his, her smile blooming like spring after a long winter. "Us," she echoed. "I like that." Ryan cleared his throat loudly, grinning. "Just so you know, I'm cool with this. As long as she likes tacos." Claire laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "Love tacos. Then you're good," Ryan said, leaning back with a satisfied smirk. Joe chuckled, shaking his head. "Kids got priorities. Smart priorities," Claire said, her eyes dancing. When Marlene returned with their food, she set the plates down with a flourish, her gaze sharp as ever. "Well," she said, smirking, "looks like Joe Riggs finally found someone who can keep up." Joe smiled, squeezing Claire's hand. "Looks that way." And as laughter filled the booth, as sunlight spilled across the worn Formica table, Joe realized something. Life wasn't about forever. It wasn't about perfect endings or grand gestures. It was about moments like this, simple, honest, real. And for the first time in a long time, Joe Riggs felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Chapter 11. Sunday dinner and surprises. Joe had never seen Ryan move so fast. The kid was practically vibrating as he set the table, stacking plates like he was auditioning for a speed-run competition. "Slow down," Joe said, laughing as he carried a bowl of salad to the table. "It's just dinner." Ryan shot him a look. "It's not just dinner. Claire's coming." Joe grinned, shaking his head. "You like her?" Ryan shrugged, but his smirk gave him away. "She's cool. And she didn't freak out when I told her about my taco obsession." "That's your gold standard for people now?" Joe teased. "Pretty much," Ryan said, dropping forks with a flourish. "Also, she didn't treat me like a little kid. That's rare." Joe's chest warmed. Claire had that effect, making people feel seen. It was one of the reasons Joe couldn't stop thinking about her. The doorbell rang, and Ryan bolted like a sprinter. Joe followed at a more reasonable pace, opening the door to find Claire standing there with a bottle of wine and a smile that made his heart trip over itself. "Hope I'm not late," she said. "Right on time," Joe replied, stepping aside. "Come on in." Dinner was easy. Laughter flowed like water, stories bouncing between them. Claire asked Ryan about school, listened like his answers mattered. Ryan, in turn, grilled her about tech stuff, his curiosity sparking like fireworks. Halfway through dessert, apple pie because Joe believed in tradition, Ryan leaned back, grinning. "So, are you guys like, dating?" Joe choked on his coffee. Claire laughed, eyes dancing. "Ryan." "What?" Ryan said innocently. "I'm just asking." Joe cleared his throat, cheeks burning. "We're figuring things out." Ryan smirked. "Looks figured out to me." Claire laughed again, and Joe couldn't help but join her. Because maybe Ryan was right. Chapter 12, the first real test. Things were good. Better than good. Joe and Claire had fallen into a rhythm. Coffee dates, late-night calls, stolen moments that felt like they belonged to another life. But life had a way of testing you when you least expected it. For Joe, the test came on a Thursday morning, in the form of a phone call from Ryan's school. "Mr. Riggs," the principal said, her tone tight. "Ryan was involved in an altercation." Joe's stomach dropped. "Is he okay?" "He's fine," she said quickly. "But he punched another student." Joe closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "I'll be there in 20. By the time Joe arrived, Ryan was sitting in the office, arms crossed, jaw set. Joe crouched in front of him, voice calm but firm. "Talk to me." Ryan hesitated, then muttered. "He called Mom a gold digger. Said she left you because you're broke." Joe felt anger flare, hot and sharp. "So you hit him?" Ryan's chin lifted. "Yeah." Joe sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Kid, I'm not sorry," Ryan said fiercely. He was wrong. Joe swallowed hard, pride and frustration tangling in his chest. Before he could respond, a voice cut in. "Is everything okay?" Joe turned, and there was Claire, standing in the doorway, concern etched across her face. She'd come the second she heard. No hesitation, no excuses. And in that moment, Joe realized something. This wasn't just about him and Claire. It was about all of them, messy, complicated, real. Later, after the meeting, after the apologies and the promises, Joe and Claire stood in the parking lot, the cool air wrapping around them. You didn't have to come, Joe said quietly. I wanted to, Claire replied. Ryan matters to you. That means he matters to me. Joe stared at her, the weight of her words sinking deep. You're incredible. Claire smiled softly. So are you. And just like that, the test didn't feel so heavy anymore. Chapter 13. A new chapter. 2 weeks later, Joe found himself back at the diner. But this time, it wasn't just him and Claire. Ryan was there, too, and so were Claire's bodyguards, who looked hilariously out of place in a booth with checkered vinyl seats. Marlene eyed the group like she was witnessing a miracle. Well, she said, smirking. Looks like Joe Riggs finally started his own sitcom. Joe laughed, sliding into the booth beside Claire. Don't give Hollywood any ideas. Claire grinned, her hand finding his under the table. Too late. We're already living it. Ryan groaned. Please don't make it weird. Joe chuckled, squeezing Claire's hand. No promises. As the afternoon sun spilled through the windows, laughter filled the diner, warm, bright, real. And Joe realized something he'd known all along but hadn't dared to believe. Not every story ends with forever, but some stories, they begin with a simple act of kindness. And if you're lucky, they turn into something you never saw coming. Joe looked at Claire, at Ryan, at the life unfolding in front of him, and smiled. Because this was his new chapter. Epilogue. The view from here, spring had settled over the city like a soft blanket, painting the streets in sunlight and the trees in tender green. Joe Riggs stood on the balcony of Claire's apartment, a mug of coffee warming his hands, the hum of traffic far below blending with the distant chatter of birds. Behind him, laughter floated from the kitchen, Ryan and Claire arguing good-naturedly over the proper way to make pancakes. Joe smiled, letting the sound sink deep. It was the kind of laughter that filled spaces, that made walls feel less like barriers and more like home. He'd never imagined this. Not in a million years. A year ago, his life had been simple: work, parenting schedules, the occasional poker night with Frank. Comfortable, predictable, safe. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday, he'd seen a woman walking down Main Street with 2 men in suits behind her. And everything changed. Claire Donovan, CEO, powerhouse, the woman who could silence a room with a glance, and laugh like sunlight breaking through clouds. She turned his world upside down, and somehow, it felt right. Joe sipped his coffee, watching as Claire appeared in the doorway, her hair loose, her smile soft. She crossed to him, sliding her arms around his waist like it was the most natural thing in the world. Pancakes are a disaster, she murmured against his shoulder. Joe chuckled. Ryan's fault. Entirely, she said, grinning. He thinks chocolate chips belong in everything. He's not wrong, Joe said, kissing the top of her head. Claire laughed, then tilted her face up to his. You happy? Joe looked at her, really looked, and felt the answer settle in his bones. Yeah, he said softly. More than I thought I could be. She smiled, her eyes shining. Me too. Later, as they sat around the table, Joe, Claire, Ryan, and a plate of slightly lopsided pancakes, Joe realized something he'd known all along but hadn't dared to believe. Life wasn't about perfect plans or forever promises. It was about moments like this, messy, honest, real. And if you were lucky, those moments turned into something bigger. Something worth holding on to. Joe reached for Claire's hand under the table, her fingers curling around his like they belonged there. Ryan groaned dramatically, muttering something about gross, but Joe just laughed, because this was the view from here, and it was everything.